In today's video, I'm going to be speaking especially to women. If you have ever been through a season in your life where you've just experienced total devastation, you've just been through this situation where you possibly felt that God was not there with you. Well, I want to give you a word of encouragement today and show you from this story that God is not only with you in that time of trial, but He wants to bring you through, and He wants to give you a blessing that's much bigger than you could even imagine. Stay tuned. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the widow with the never-ending cruse of oil. It's a really encouraging story, a miraculous story. Even though I have heard this story since childhood, it really hit a different chord for me the other day when I read the story again. And I think you'll see what I mean. And it's really encouraging to know, having been through that kind of season in my own experience, that God is there. He's waiting to bless His daughters. And it's also a lesson for us about female entrepreneurship, which we don't see a whole lot of examples of in the Bible. So I'd like to share that with you. Join me as we read 2 Kings chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 7. We'll read through it first, and then I want to highlight a few really important things in here. Let's read that. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1, and I'm reading from the King James Version. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in thy house? And she said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house, save a pot of oil. Then he said, Go, borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him, and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go, sell the oil, pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. I want to back up to verse 1 because there are some details in there that I'd really like us to pay attention to. And especially since we're also looking at the financial aspect today, I want to take a look at some of the habits that we can see from this family that they exemplified. Because, when we want God to bless us, we also have to make sure that we are obedient to what He has already called us to do. Obedient in our finances as well, especially if we're looking for a financial outpouring. And we'll see that this widow, this family, even before she became a widow, was fulfilling that commandment of being responsible with their finances. And in verse 1, it says, There cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets. And what this says to me is it lets us know that she was not wealthy. They were not a wealthy family. They struggled to make ends meet. They were not the first couple of a mega church. They were just trudging along, doing what God asked them to do. And we know that because she says, And thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord. So this was the godly man. And unfortunately, he took ill and died and left a massive debt for his wife and 2 sons. And so this widow comes to Elisha in desperation for help, because it says now that the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. You see, In that time, when you owed a debt, not only did you have the collateral of perhaps your property, but when you run out of collateral, they take your children as well to pay off your debt and they become their servants. Now you may say, well, in today's, in today's environment, they don't take our children, so I don't have to worry about that. But our children become bondmen because of our unfortunate circumstances, sometimes, like in this case, where the husband became ill and died. One of the biggest ways that families become bankrupted in the United States is through medical debt. A diagnosis of something like cancer or MS or something like this can really bankrupt a family and leave them with debts that are astronomical, that it's beyond their ability to possibly pay. And this was the circumstance that she was facing. And the creditor was now come to take her children. Now, I also want you to notice that the Bible doesn't say the creditors, plural, were come. One creditor. Okay, so this is not a family that was in the habit of racking up debt. They were not in the habit of going after all of their wants and trying to keep up with the Joneses. Okay, they were good stewards of what God had blessed them with, whatever amount that was. And so there was this one creditor that they owed a massive amount of money. And she comes to Elisha now in desperation. Help me, help me. I'm about to lose everything, including my children. And Elisha says unto her, what shall I do for thee? I like that question because, isn't God so wonderful that he actually allows us to tell him what it is that we would like him to do for us. If you have a good friend or a child and their birthday is coming up, you already have a pretty good idea of what they want and what would make them happy. But isn't it even just that much more special when you ask them what they would like to get? You're able to provide them with that special surprise, that one thing that their heart desires. Their joy is just that much more profound. And so God gives us the opportunity so often to tell him what it is that we desire. And so Elisha says, what shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? This is the second part of the question that I really love about God, because whatever God wants to do for you, whatever God has called you to, he has already equipped you with all that you need to fulfill his purpose and his plan. And you might think, well, I don't have much. I don't have anything left. I don't have the six-figure income. I'm not a public speaker, to go and do what God has called me to do. I need to get a better education. I need to go back to school and get my MBA. Or I'm too old, or I'm too young. This is not something that I can start at this point in my life. But the thing about God is, he is the creator of the universe. He is not dependent on what we have in order to fulfill his purpose. Whatever you have left, no matter what the destroyer has taken away from you, no matter how crumbled, how broken you feel that you are right now, God can still take whatever you have left and turn it into something amazing and powerful. When God called Moses back in Genesis, Moses was in the wilderness and he saw a bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burned up. And he got curious and he came over, and there God met him in the desert. And God called him to go and deliver the children of Israel from Egypt. And Moses started to make excuses like we all do. I can't speak. I stutter. And God said, you have your brother. He can speak for you. But God, I really don't know. And God said, what do you have in your hand? And he said, a rod. And God said, cast it down. And Moses cast the rod down and it turned into a serpent. And God told him to pick it back up and it came from a serpent back into a rod. God will ask you, what do you have in your hand? Whatever it is you have left, as little as that may be, he wants you to take it and to offer it to him. Give it back to him and say, here, Lord, I'm yours. What I have is yours. Everything I have is yours. Take it and do your work through me. And when we are willing to offer that to him, then he can do the impossible. So Elisha says, what hast thou in the house? And she said, thine handmaid hath not anything in the house save a pot of oil. That's all she had left. She had already done everything that she possibly could to get the money to be able to pay the creditor. She had nothing left in her house except a little pot of oil. And he said, go, borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels. Borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons. Now, I want to stop here for a moment. You see, Elisha doesn't tell the widow the entire plan when she comes to him. He only gives her the first instruction, which was to go and borrow vessels from her neighbors and fill them with oil. She had no idea why he was telling her to do this. Now, we have the luxury of knowing the end of the story, but she didn't know the end of the story. But she was obedient to what God called her to do, that first instruction. When God came to Abraham, he came to Abram and told him to leave his father's house and to go to a land that I will show you. In other words, he didn't tell Abram where he was going. He only told him to leave. And in the leaving, once he was obedient to that first instruction, then God began to reveal to him where he wanted him to go. And so we need to be obedient to the instruction that God has given us, whether or not we understand all of it. You see, the reason why we don't want to be obedient to that first instruction is because we want to analyze God's plan for ourselves and decide whether or not it's something that could be fruitful. Imagine our audacity to think that we have any power to change our circumstance. That's why we came to him in the first place, right? Because if we had the power to change our circumstance, we would have changed it already. We wouldn't be coming to him with this need, even though we should. And so we want God to give us the entire plan before we even take the first step out the door. Well, we have to be willing to trust God. We have to be willing to trust God enough that we will walk in the first steps that he has given us. We need to be willing to trust him. We need to do the walking so he can do the working. I'll say that again. We need to start doing the walking so he can do the working. She came to her neighbors and she asked for vessels of oil. And Elijah said, borrow not a few. He left it up to the widow to determine what not a few meant. And she could have asked herself, well, I have filled up my entire living room with all of these pots. Surely that's enough, isn't it? Does not a few mean just my living room? Or does not a few mean my living room and my dining room? Or does not a few mean my living room and dining room and my kitchen? Well, what about the bedrooms? What about the hallways? This widow did something that we need to do as followers of Christ. She left such a powerful example of trust in God. Because what she did was she maxed out her capacity. She didn't just fill one room. She didn't just fill a second room. She filled every space that was possible in her house. How do we know that? Because at the end of the story, when we get there, we find out that once she is told what she should do in step number 2, that she had enough money for her children to live out their lives. That would not have been possible if she only trusted in a little God. You know, how big is your need? How big is your God? She maxed out her capacity. She trusted God and trusted that He was a big God. And she was going to believe Him for the impossible. And she was going to believe Him to abundantly bless so that there was not room enough to receive. That's the kind of God she knew she served. Is that the kind of God that you serve? So the widow comes back to Elisha now that she has followed God's commandment. She doesn't know why. She has filled the vessels with oil, but she has been obedient. And Elisha says to her, "Go and sell the oil, pay the debt, and live thou and thy children off the rest." I'm so glad I serve a God of abundance, that He is willing to open the windows of heaven and pour us out such a blessing that we won't even have room enough to receive. If we would only trust Him, if we would only believe that He is a God big enough. There's one more thing that I wanted to point out in this lesson. And it says in the verse, it says in verse 4, "And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons." Why would Elisha tell the widow this? Well, it reminds me of something else in Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, we have another illustration where God tells us that we should shut the door. And it says there, "But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to the Father, which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly." In other words, she closed that door, and just between her and her Lord, she laid it out before the Lord and gave everything to Him, her and her sons, the ones who had the need, and said, "Father, we lay this before you." She didn't have to make it public. She didn't have to tell her neighbors why the servant of God told her to gather all of these vessels, because one thing we know for sure is that everybody didn't believe as she did. We know that Jesus said many times, "According to your faith, be it unto you." In fact, He had to kick out those who didn't have the faith when He went to raise the ruler's daughter. So in closing the door upon her and her sons, they reached out in faith to the hand of God and left to the side those who would hinder their belief. And the God who sees in secret will reward us openly. The last thing I want to leave with you today is that when you bring to God what He has asked of you, He is responsible for the outcome. So if He has given you a purpose, a plan, a dream, an idea that He wants for you to carry out, you do your part and trust Him to do His. I want to pray to close. I want to thank you that you are the God of abundance and blessings, and no matter what kind of devastation we've seen in our lives, that you are able to restore, you're able to renew, you are able to turn the tables and give us an abundant blessing more than we can even imagine. But we first, Lord, have to be willing to give it all to you. We have to, in faith, reach out our hand and say, "Lord, whatever I have left, as little as it may seem to me, that you can take the little I have and you can, in your way, in your powerful way, multiply." I thank you for being a God who will work with even the little faith that we have. And for those of you out there, those women entrepreneurs who might be thinking that it's too late for you, I want this story to encourage you that it is never too late. It is never too late. If God has put a desire on your heart, that means that He has given you what you need. Click subscribe. Let us know your thoughts. be sure to share with a friend, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Be blessed.